The hearing chamber of the House Oversight Committee had grown so still that even the faint hum of cameras seemed amplified. Steve Bannon, summoned as a witness on election procedures, suddenly slammed his fist against the table, the sharp sound echoing through the marble room. His face flushed crimson with fury. For 15 minutes straight, Representative Jasmine Crockett had been questioning him with surgical precision, calmly dissecting his podcast statements about voting systems, aligning them against verifiable records, and exposing the gaps between his public rhetoric and the documented facts. "Representative Crockett," Bannon thundered, stabbing the air with his finger. "This right here is the problem with Washington. You people sit in your ivory towers, completely cut off from real Americans. I've spoken to thousands of patriots who've seen the problems firsthand. Your so-called facts are nothing but establishment talking points. Propaganda meant to gaslight the American people. The war room audience knows the truth, even if this committee refuses to hear it." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the committee room as Bannon's tirade continued. His gestures grew increasingly dramatic, his voice booming, filling every inch of the chamber with populist fury. Chairman Comer's hand hovered near his gavel, a silent question of whether to intervene. But he hesitated, watching as the outburst unfolded. When Bannon finally stopped to catch his breath, an uneasy silence settled. The camera zoomed in on Representative Crockett, who sat perfectly still, her expression composed, her eyes fixed on the witness with calm intensity. After 3 seconds, she leaned forward, opened a blue folder on her desk, and lifted a single document into view for the record and the cameras. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone even and deliberate, "I'd like to submit for the record a sworn affidavit from Mr. Bannon's own counsel, dated March 14th of last year, filed in case number CV222257863 in the Northern District of Georgia." She glanced briefly toward Bannon before continuing. "On page 7, paragraph 4, counsel explicitly states, and I quote, Mr. Bannon acknowledges he possesses no personal knowledge or direct evidence of any voting machine irregularities. His public statements were based on third-party claims that have since been retracted." Crockett paused just long enough for the words to land, then added, "This document bears Mr. Bannon's own signature under penalty of perjury. It directly contradicts the testimony he just gave this committee." The impact was immediate. The air itself seemed to still. Bannon's expression froze. The crimson in his cheeks drained into an ashen stillness. Around the dais, committee members exchanged astonished looks. Chairman Comer cleared his throat and reached for his water glass, suddenly fascinated by it, carefully avoiding the witness's glare. Before diving deeper into this extraordinary confrontation between a political firebrand and a disciplined legislator, make sure to comment where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming political analysis. Representative Jasmine Crockett had built her reputation in Congress not through theatrics, but through precision. A lawmaker whose every question came armed with documentation. A former attorney seasoned in election law and civil rights litigation. She treated oversight like litigation, detail by detail, document by document. Before her election to Congress, Crockett had served as special counsel to her state's election commission, where she became intimately familiar with the technical mechanics of democracy. Voting machines, ballot verification, chain of custody procedures, and federal election standards. This background made her one of the few members of Congress who could move seamlessly between constitutional theory and the granular realities of how ballots are cast, counted, and contested. Effective oversight isn't about sound bites, she had said during her first campaign speech. It's about verifying claims against evidence and holding public figures accountable to their own words. Democracy doesn't survive on noise. It survives on truth. At 42, Crockett carried herself with the same meticulous energy that had defined her courtroom years. While others leaned on staff memos and briefing binders, she dove personally into every witness's history, reading depositions, cross-checking filings, and analyzing transcripts for inconsistencies. Time and again, she unearthed contradictions her peers had missed, and in this hearing, that preparation had turned into precision firepower. Steve Bannon's path to prominence couldn't have been more different. The former White House strategist and media provocateur had reinvented himself as a populist oracle, host of the War Room podcast, a digital pulpit that broadcast to millions daily. His tone was part preacher, part general, his rhetoric a blend of patriotism and apocalypse. Since leaving government, Bannon had cast himself as the voice of forgotten Americans, a crusader against what he called the administrative state. His followers viewed him as a truth-teller battling entrenched corruption, his critics, as a manipulator of anger and misinformation. But both sides agreed. When Bannon spoke, people listened. Republican members of the Oversight Committee had pressed for his testimony, arguing that he represented a constituency deeply concerned about election integrity. "The establishment doesn't want to hear from voices like mine," Bannon told reporters before the hearing. "They prefer credentialed experts who reinforce their narrative. I represent the millions who've been shut out. Citizens who see a system that no longer belongs to them." The hearing itself focused on proposed federal standards for election procedures, particularly voting system security and ballot verification rules. It was meant to be procedural. No one expected fireworks. But once Bannon and Crockett faced each other, predictability vanished. Both were formidable communicators, but their methods couldn't have been more opposed. Bannon, fiery and emotional; Crockett, calm and relentlessly factual. The contrast was magnetic and combustible. Chairman Comer struck his gavel at precisely 10 a.m. "This committee will come to order," he said. "Today's hearing will examine proposed legislation on election procedures and federal standards. Our first witness is Mr. Steve Bannon. Mr. Bannon, you have 5 minutes for your opening remarks." Bannon leaned into the microphone, his gravelly voice brimming with conviction. "Millions of Americans have lost faith in our elections," he began. "These aren't conspiracy theorists. These are working-class patriots who love their country and no longer trust the system meant to represent them." His tone rose with each sentence, blending indignation and passion. He cited scattered anecdotes of alleged irregularities, late-night ballot drops, malfunctioning machines, suspicious tabulations, without providing concrete documentation. Instead, he appealed to emotion. When ordinary Americans see ballots counted twice, or votes mysteriously flipping between candidates, they know something's wrong. Washington may sneer, but the people know what they saw. The initial questioning went predictably. Republican members praised Bannon for giving voice to voter concerns. Democratic members pressed for data he couldn't produce. But when it was Representative Crockett's turn, the atmosphere shifted. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone crisp and professional. "Mr. Bannon, I'd like to discuss specific statements you've made about voting machines." Bannon leaned back, watching her warily. "On your January 17th broadcast," Crockett continued, "you claimed to possess definitive evidence that voting machines in Maricopa County had been compromised by foreign actors. Can you describe this evidence for the committee?" Bannon's eyes narrowed. "Representative, patriots on the ground in Arizona documented numerous irregularities. The evidence is overwhelming when you look at statistical anomalies and first-hand witness accounts." "I understand that you believe there were irregularities," Crockett replied, maintaining her composure. "But your statement referenced definitive evidence of foreign involvement. What specifically were you referring to?" The precision of her question seemed to momentarily disarm him. He hesitated, glanced at his notes, then replied more forcefully. "The evidence is in the data patterns. When vote totals defy statistical probability, that's manipulation. I've had cybersecurity experts on my show who confirmed these vulnerabilities." "Could you provide the names of these experts and the substance of their findings?" Crockett asked evenly. Bannon bristled. "I've had dozens of experts. I don't have their names in front of me. But the American people don't need credentials to see what's happening." Crockett nodded slightly. "Understood. Then let's discuss another example. On February 3rd, you cited a report allegedly authored by Dr. Andrew Appel of Princeton University that documented foreign access to Arizona voting machines. Dr. Appel has since publicly stated he wrote no such report and has seen no evidence of foreign compromise. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Bannon's jaw tightened. His voice rose. "Look, I host hundreds of guests and thousands of reports get mentioned. If one academic wants to nitpick, that doesn't change the larger truth that millions of Americans don't trust this system. The establishment loves focusing on one detail to distract from the big picture." Crockett inclined her head. "I appreciate your concern for public confidence, Mr. Bannon," she said smoothly. "But this committee deals in documented facts, not impressions. However, I'm trying to establish the factual basis for specific claims you've presented as evidence. On March 10th, you stated that local officials in 15 counties have confirmed voting machine manipulations. Yet, when my office contacted election officials in each of these counties, all 15 denied making any such confirmation. In fact, officials in 12 of these counties issued a joint statement specifically refuting this claim." She held up the joint statement. "This isn't about broader concerns. It's about a specific factual claim you made that appears to be contradicted by the very officials you cited. Could you explain this discrepancy? This methodical highlighting of specific contradictions? each documented with direct quotes and verifiable responses, created a palpable shift in the hearing room atmosphere. Committee members from both parties now appeared more engaged, some leaning forward as Bannon's responses grew increasingly defensive. "Representative, you're using classic establishment tactics here, focusing on technical details while ignoring the forest for the trees. I speak to patriots across this country every day who have seen problems firsthand. Your so-called fact checks don't change what people experienced." "Mr. Bannon, I'm not questioning anyone's sincere concerns," Crockett responded calmly. "I'm specifically addressing claims you've presented as factual evidence. On April 24th, you stated that you personally had seen documented proof of systematic ballot manipulation in Fulton County, Georgia. Yet, in a court filing dated March 14th, your own attorney submitted a statement signed by you acknowledging that you had no personal knowledge or direct evidence of voting irregularities in Fulton County or elsewhere." She held up a legal document. "This sworn statement directly contradicts what you told your audience. Could you explain why you claim to have seen documented proof when you acknowledged under oath that you had no such evidence?" This third documented contradiction, now involving Bannon's own sworn statement versus his public claims, appeared to hit a nerve. Bannon's expression darkened as his response became more heated. "This is exactly why the American people don't trust Congress or the courts. You take statements out of context, twist legal filings, and ignore the experiences of millions of patriots. Legal language in court filings is a completely different context from discussions about what's really happening in this country." Crockett maintained her composed demeanor. "I'm not characterizing the statement. I'm quoting it directly. This isn't about legal technicalities. It's about the contradiction between telling your audience you've seen documented proof while stating under oath that you have no personal knowledge or direct evidence. Both statements cannot simultaneously be true." This direct but factual challenge to Bannon's credibility without raising her voice or making it personal seemed to frustrate him more than angry accusations might have. His response escalated into the explosive moment that would define the hearing. "Representative Crockett," Bannon shouted, pounding his fist on the table. "This is exactly the problem with Washington. You people sit in your ivory towers completely disconnected from real Americans. I've talked to thousands of patriots across this country who've seen the problems firsthand. Your so-called facts are just establishment talking points designed to gaslight the American people. The war room audience knows the truth, even if this committee doesn't want to hear it." His voice echoed through the chamber as committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Chairman Komar seemed uncertain whether to intervene as Bannon continued his emotional tirade, gesturing dramatically toward Crockett, who remained motionless and composed. For 3 seconds after Bannon finally paused for breath, Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she studied the witness. Then she calmly opened a blue folder on her desk, removed a single document, and held it up for the cameras. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice measured and composed, "I'd like to submit for the record this sworn affidavit from Mr. Impacted, Bannon's own attorney, dated March 14th of last year, filed in case number CB in the Northern District of Georgia. On page 7, paragraph 4, his counsel explicitly states, Mr. Bannon acknowledges that he has no personal knowledge or direct evidence of any voting machine irregularities, and his statements were based on third-party claims that have since been publicly retracted." This document was signed by Mr. Bannon himself under penalty of perjury, directly contradicting the claims he just made to this committee. The room fell completely silent. Bannon's expression froze as committee members exchanged startled glances. The specific documented contradiction between his emotional testimony and his own sworn statement created a moment of clarity that transcended typical partisan divisions. Chairman Com, recognizing the significance of themament, cleared his throat. "Without objection, the document will be entered into the record. The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes, but the dynamic of the hearing had fundamentally changed. What began as routine partisan theater had transformed into a powerful demonstration of the difference between emotional assertions and documented facts, a distinction that seemed to momentarily transcend the committee's usual political divisions." As questioning continued, the impact of Crockett's evidence reverberated through the committee room in subtle but unmistakable ways. Members from both parties now approached their questioning with noticeably greater precision, several directly referencing the sworn statement Crockett had introduced. Representative Turner, a Republican from Ohio, reflected this shift in his questioning. "Mr. Bannon, I want to better understand the nature of your testimony today. Are you presenting what you personally know to be factual, or are you representing concerns you've heard from others without personally verifying them? This distinction seems important for the committee's understanding of your testimony." This question, focusing on the factual basis of testimony rather than its political implications, indicated that Crockett's evidence-based approach had influenced the committee's entire inquiry. Bannon's response appeared more measured than his earlier statements. Congressman, I'm presenting concerns that I believe deserve investigation. While I may not have personally examined voting machines or ballots, I've spoken with thousands of Americans who have serious concerns about election integrity. Their voices deserve to be heard, even if they don't have the platform I do. This more nuanced characterization of his testimony, acknowledging the distinction between personal knowledge and reported concerns, represented a ever-way significant shift from his earlier presentation of claims as established facts. The witness appeared to recognize that specific documentary evidence had changed the hearing's dynamic from partisan theater to factual accountability. Throughout this portion of the hearing, Bannon maintained a more restrained demeanor. The animated combative style that characterized his opening statement had given way to more careful formulations that distinguished between verified facts and unverified concerns. This shift was particularly noticeable when Representative Norman, typically a Bannon ally, asked about specific claims regarding voting machine vulnerabilities. I've raised questions about these systems based on what I've been told by experts. Bannon responded, noticeably avoiding his earlier claims of definitive evidence or documented proof. These concerns merit investigation, though I acknowledge I haven't personally examined the machines or code. When questioning returned to Crockett in the second round, she maintained her methodical evidence-based approach rather than pressing her advantage after Bannon's outburst. Mr. Bannon, setting aside specific claims about past elections, I'd like to focus on constructive improvements to election transparency. She began shifting toward forward-looking policy rather than backward-looking accusations. Given your stated concerns about public confidence in elections, what specific practical transparency measures would you support that could address these perception issues while maintaining election security? This question, offering Bannon an opportunity to contribute constructively rather than merely defending past statements, demonstrated Crockett's emphasis on substantive outcomes over personal or partisan advantage. Bannon appeared to appreciate the opportunity to move beyond the previous confrontation. That's a fair question, Representative. I believe we need greater transparency in the ballot verification process, possibly including live-streamed counts and more robust citizen observation opportunities. While maintaining ballot secrecy, the process itself should be as visible as possible to rebuild trust. Thank you. That's helpful, Crockett responded. Building on that point, would you support a standardized post-election audit process that includes representatives from all parties to verify results similar to the model used in Colorado that has earned bipartisan support? This continued focus on constructive policy, rather than returning to Bannon's contradictory statements, allowed the hearing to evolve from confrontation to substantive discussion. Bannon engaged more thoughtfully with these policy questions than he had with challenges to his factual claims. I think robust audits with multi-partisan participation make sense. The key is ensuring ordinary citizens feel the process is transparent, rather than just having experts tell them everything is fine. People need to see the process for themselves to trust it. As the hearing progressed toward conclusion, Chairman Comer acknowledged the unexpected evolution in the discussion. Today's hearing has covered significant ground, from specific concerns about past elections to constructive proposals for improving transparency and public confidence going forward. While members may disagree about certain factual assertions, there appears to be some common ground regarding transparency measures that could strengthen our electoral system. This closing characterization, acknowledging both the factual disputes and the areas of potential consensus, reflected a tactful recognition of how the hearing had evolved from partisan positioning to more substantive policy discussion following Crockett's intervention. As members gathered their materials after adjournment, the unusual nature of what had transpired was evident in their conversations. A veteran committee staffer was overheard telling a colleague, "I've never seen documentation flip a hearing like that." She didn't have to say anything after showing that affidavit. It spoke for itself. For journalists covering the committee, the story had transformed from predictable partisan theater to something far more significant. A political correspondent texted her editor. The Crockett-Bannon exchange crystallized the entire disinformation debate in 5 minutes. Her methodical evidence versus his emotional appeals provided the perfect visual for the larger story we've been trying to tell. By evening, clips of the exchange between Representative Crockett and Steve Bannon had spread widely across media platforms. What caught viewers' attention, however, wasn't merely themamentary confrontation, but the stark contrast between documented evidence and emotional assertions that had been laid bare in that moment. The Washington Post's media analyst captured this distinction in an analysis titled, "When Evidence Meets Emotion, the Crockett-Bannon Oversight Moment." The article noted that beyond the brief dramatic confrontation, yesterday's hearing demonstrated the fundamental tension in contemporary political discourse between documented facts and emotional appeals. Crockett's methodical presentation of Bannon's own sworn statement against his public claims provided a rare moment of clarity in an increasingly murky information landscape. Media analysts across the political spectrum acknowledged the significance of the exchange, though they characterized it differently. Conservative commentator Charlie Sykes observed Bannon made a critical error by presenting as factual claims he had previously acknowledged under oath were unverified. The lesson isn't ideological, but tactical emotional appeals collapse when directly contradicted by documentary evidence, especially one's own sworn statements. Progressive analyst Brian Stelter offered a different perspective. What made Crockett's approach so effective wasn't just catching a contradiction, but how she let the evidence speak for itself. She didn't need to attack Bannon personally or match his emotional intensity. She simply presented the document and let viewers draw their own conclusions. That's information literacy in action. For Bannon, the aftermath required careful navigation. His initial response on his podcast characterizing the hearing as a typical establishment ambush gained limited traction as clips of his sworn statement spread widely across platforms typically sympathetic to his perspective. The documentary evidence proved difficult to dismiss, with the rhetorical techniques that had served him effectively in other contexts. 3 days after the hearing, Bannon demonstrated his media savvy by pivoting to a forward-looking message. On his podcast, he acknowledged in legal settings, statements have precise, technical meanings that don't always translate to broader discussions about real concerns. Rather than relitigating specific wording in past statements, I'm focused on ensuring future elections have the transparency Americans deserve. The specific reforms I discussed with Representative Crockett could actually improve our system, regardless of where you stand politically. This strategic pivot from defending past statements to advocating future reforms allowed Bannon to maintain his brand as a populist advocate while moving beyond a difficult moment. Media observers noted this repositioning, with one commenting, "Bannon has effectively transformed what could have been a credibility-damaging moment into an opportunity to position himself as a constructive voice for reform rather than merely a critic." For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased attention to her methodical approach to oversight. Profile piece highlighted her background in election law and her commitment to evidence-based evaluation rather than partisan positioning. The Atlantic published an analysis titled "The Documented Representative: Crockett's Evidence-Centered Approach to Oversight," noting that her focus on specific documentary evidence rather than general criticism or partisan framing represented an increasingly rare approach in contemporary congressional proceedings. In an interview on PBS NewsHour, Crockett maintained her focus on substance rather than personality. When asked about the confrontation with Bannon, she redirected, "What matters isn't the momentary exchange, but the larger principle." It illustrated that democracy depends on a shared commitment to factual reality. Despite our political disagreements, the transparency measures Mr. Bannon and he discussed after that moment actually represent constructive common ground that could strengthen public confidence in our electoral system. This response, prioritizing democratic principles and policy outcomes over personal or partisan advantage, reinforced Crockett's reputation as a substance-focused legislator more interested in institutional effectiveness than political theater. The substantive impact extended beyond the momentary confrontation. 2 weeks after the hearing, a bipartisan group of representatives announced the Election Transparency Enhancement Act, which incorporated several of the specific measures discussed during the constructive portion of the Bannon-Crockett exchange. The legislation included standardized post-election audit procedures, enhanced observer access provisions, and live streaming requirements for certain election processes. In announcing the legislation, representatives from both parties acknowledged its origins in the oversight hearing. Representative Davis, a Republican co-sponsor, noted, "Despite significant disagreements about past elections, this legislation focuses on constructive improvements that can strengthen public confidence going forward." The transparency measures emerged from areas of consensus, even among witnesses and members with very different perspectives on current election systems. For election administrators across the country, this constructive outcome from what could have been merely another partisan hearing represented a welcome development. A state election director commented to colleagues, "For once, congressional oversight produced something besides partisan talking points. These transparency standards actually address perception issues while maintaining security, exactly the balance we've been advocating." Perhaps most significantly, The Crockett-Bannon exchange catalyzed a broader conversation about evidence standards in public discourse. Several major news organizations announced enhanced fact-checking protocols that would require sources to distinguish between verified personal knowledge and unverified third-party claims. The precise distinction Crockett's questioning had highlighted. 6 months after the confrontation, its impact continued to resonate in discussions of information literacy and democratic discourse. When Stanford University launched its Democracy and Discourse Initiative, the opening symposium featured the Crockett-Bannon exchange as a case study and evidence evaluation, contrasting emotional appeals with documented facts. The program director explained the selection. This exchange crystallized a fundamental tension in contemporary political communication between appeals based on how information makes people feel and evaluation based on documented evidence. Understanding this distinction is essential for citizens navigating today's complex information landscape. For those studying political communication, the Crockett-Bannon exchange became a textbook example of the power of documentation over assertion. The Columbia Journalism School incorporated the clip into its curriculum on political reporting, using it to illustrate the journalistic principle that documentation transcends characterization, that verified primary sources carry greater weight than even the most emotionally compelling narratives. The lasting legacy of their confrontation wasn't about personal victory or defeat, but about illuminating a fundamental principle of democratic discourse that sworn statements and documented evidence must ultimately take precedence over emotional appeals and unverified assertions, regardless of how powerfully or sincerely those assertions are expressed. As media scholar Jay Rosen observed a year later, what made this moment significant wasn't just exposing a contradiction, but demonstrating in real time why evidence standards matter in democratic discourse. When the most eloquent emotional appeal meets documented facts, especially one's own sworn statements, the result isn't a matter of opinion, but a fundamental distinction between verifiable reality and unverifiable claims. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important political developments. Leave a comment below, sharing your thoughts on the role of evidence in political discourse.